Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bach Network Session Roundtable, J.S. Bach and the History of Emotions. My name is David Irving. I'm an Ecrea professor at the Institució Meli Fontanals de Recerca en Humanitats, which is CSIC in Barcelona, although I'm currently on a visiting fellowship at Clare Hall, Cambridge, so I'm beaming in from there. And now I'll pass over to Bettina. Thank you very much, Bettina.
Thank you, David, for this introduction, and thank you all for joining us. I hope some of you had a chance to watch our pre-recorded video where each of us introduced some aspects of our current thinking about Bach and emotions. So my own approach, to summarize very briefly, looks at the way that early 18th century bodies and souls were understood to work as a foundation for then thinking about how music could have had this power to move the affections in those human body souls. So in a nutshell, early modern human bodies were experienced as porous and volatile systems of flow. So they were permeated by various liquids, such as blood and humus and spirits, and they were susceptible to influxes from the environment that could tamper with those flows. So music, as one kind of this material influx, could penetrate a listener's body soul to alter these flows, to wrench their innards, to soften their hearts, to raise their spirits, and so on. So I thought what I'd do in this brief opener today is offer one example of how that process might have worked. And I've chosen an aria from Bach's Matthew Passion, the bass aria, Gib mir meinen Jesum wieder. It comes after Jesus is handed over to Pilate, and it reflects on Judas's betrayal. So the text demands, "Give me back my Jesus, see the money the murderer's fee tossed at your feet." Dan Melamed has identified this as a typical rage aria. So he says it's, quote, "of a kind often given to bass singers in operas whose characters were particularly upset." But where exactly is the rage in this? A common approach would be to enumerate those features of the score that are traditionally understood to evoke rage. So according to Patrick Joslin, music psychologist, that could be fast tempo, minor mode, dissonance, high sound levels, staccato articulation, complex rhythms, and so on. So we might imagine Bach's listeners hearing this aria and decoding some of its features as representing rage, such as its fast runs and its complex rhythms, and so on. And these features could then be put alongside potential word painting elements. So, for instance, Albert Schweitzer suggested that some of the motifs in this aria depict the money being thrown onto the floor, and so on. Now, that's all well and good. But then if I go and watch, for instance, Thomas Quasthoff perform this aria in Peter Sellers's 2010 staging of the Matthew Passion, I find the sensation of rage much less represented in the notes than somehow emanating from Quasthoff's own voice and bodily comportment, and from the violinist's fingers and bow and torso moving about, and from the energy of these musical gestures that the ensemble collectively produce in real time, their timbre, their sonic impact, and so on. So the emotive potential of this aria seems to reside less in a cognitive process of representation and decoding than in a process of bodily affective transmission or contagion. So how might this kind of affective transmission have worked for an 18th century listener? The emotion of rage at the time was understood as a heightened bodily spiritual state caused by a disordered flow of the spirits around the body. So here's the English writer John Downham on the experience of anger. He says, "It makes the hair stand on end, the teeth to gnash like a furious boar, the tongue to stammer as being not able to express the rage of the heart, the blood ready to burst out of the veins, the breast to swell as being not large enough to contain their anger, and therefore seek to ease itself by sending out hot-breathing sighs, the feet to stamp the guiltless earth, so that anger deforms the body from the hair of the head to the sole of the foot." The Lutheran preacher Johann Jakob Schmidt reported even more violent symptoms, including the pulse being agitated so much that, quote, "eventually blood flows out of the mouth, nose, ears, or womb, and occasionally even the soul is driven out of the body." Now, for lack of evidence, I shall assume that none of these more drastic symptoms afflicted the musicians or listeners in Bach's Leipzig performances. But I think we might be underestimating this aria's emotive power if we reduce it to an exercise in decoding musical signifiers. Bodies, souls, and spirits were being moved, shaken, and transformed in encountering these affectively charged sounds. So I'm just very briefly going to share my screen here. So one of the most unsettling aspects of this piece in performance, I think, is the sustained irregularity of its pulse. Pulse was, of course, one of those volatile bodily motions that was easily disrupted by musical vibrations. And Bach's aria is not a rhythmically settled musical experience. So if you look at that opening downward leap of a fourth to begin with, this can become such a resolute foot-stamping gesture if an ensemble embraces the heaviness of that first down bow and its rebound. And it offers an immediate shock to the system because the instant syncopation in the upper parts labors against those two crotchet beats of the bass. And these bass crotchets then fail to settle into a steady pattern by shifting to a quaver pulse with a syncopation over the bar line and then stopping abruptly at the end of that phrase. In a 1987 recording by the Dresden Staatskapelle, I can feel that initial plunge of the upper strings into that gap between the two bass notes in the pit of my stomach. See what you think. I'll just play the opening. I think Bach's notated text affords such feelings of disruptions, unsettlement in numerous other ways as the piece unfolds. So when the voice enters, that opening leap on Gebt is an awkward way in, and that is later compounded by increasingly wide leaps in the opposite direction. So Quasthoff's voice, for instance, audibly breaks on one of these later octave jumps. And then expressive energy seems to spill out of his performance at various points. So, for instance, that gratuitous embellishment there in bar 15, or his forceful exhalations on those on the word Zed, these onbeat exhalations that seem intent to relieve that swelling of the chest that Downham noted, and also from that insignificant syllable zu, which again it has that hard attack, and it bursts in too early each time it is pronounced. So here's just one example where it comes ahead of the fourth beat of the bar. And the continuo group, their stop and start progress continues in this excerpt too, where they drop listeners into this kind of sonic pothole at the beginning of the bar there. And then they shift that rhythmic pattern from the middle of the bar to the beginning of the bar when it is repeated, and so on. And even the final cadence is overrun by this wanton extra crotchet in the solo violin. So in all these ways, I think Bach's musical script invited performers to enact and inflict on their listeners that sense of discombobulation that is articulated in Schmidt's description of anger, where he says, quote, "The body with its solid and liquid parts is being thrown or tossed about between two endpoints." What I would like to emphasize here then is that while these effects of disruption, overexertion, bursting out are all afforded by the notated text, their contagious effective charge is only activated each time anew in a moment of performance. So in a recent recording by the Netherlands Bach Society, for me it is their collective abrasive force and the rasping gut-string timbre that encapsulates that potency of anger to deform body and soul. Those vigorous string crossings produced by the solo violinist here, to my mind, offer not just a specific image of money thrown to the ground, but a sonic experience of air, spirits, or innards being torn apart and tossed about. So I think I have about a minute left, so I'm just going to play you a little bit of their performance of this aria to see if maybe we can start to hear it with ears and bodies that are a little bit more attuned to the very physicality of this affective transaction. I'll stop it here in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Bettina, for a wonderful presentation, and there's so much to take in and digest there. And we'll return to this theme during the discussion. We'll now move to the second paper of the session. Please welcome Ruth.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Bettina. I mean, it's just wonderful to hear where all this is going. So my main point in the video was that the most perfect proportions, 1:1 and 1:2, were considered the most effective to move the emotions. So I'm now going to give a little bit more theory and some more detailed examples of how. The physicists and scientists emphasize the physicality of the pulsing proportions and the unconscious calculation of the listener. So here's Leibniz in 1712. I think that the reason for consonance must be sought from the congruity of the beats, that is the sounding number. Music is a secret exercise of arithmetic where the mind is unaware that it is counting. Indeed, those who think that nothing happens in the soul of which it is not conscious are mistaken. Therefore, even if the soul does not realize it is counting, it nevertheless feels the effect of this insensible calculation. This idea proved influential and long-lasting and was still going strong in the 1800s. So here's the acoustician Chladni writing in 1802. The effects of the notes on us is based on the fact that we feel pleasantly moved by the proportions. We feel the temporal proportions of successive movements. We don't calculate them ourselves as if we were concerned about the numbers through which time and space are expressed, but rather nature counts for us, and the results of the harmonious proportions give us pleasure and are purposefully reworked by artists. He was partly citing his contemporary Herder, who wrote, "The sensitive creature feels himself moved through a reproduction of his inner strength. He feels himself pleasantly moved through proportions and can do nothing other than rest in these proportions. This is music, nothing else." So the Lutheran music theorists and theologians repeated the basic acoustical information, the perfection of the proportions 1:1 and 1:2, and then they brought God into the picture in a very major way. Here is Werkmeister in his chapter on why humans find such pleasure in music. Firstly, he says all consonances, as well as the motions of meter and beat, are purely those proportional numerals that are closest to the unison or equality 1:1. Because music is a matter of clarity and order, and as such is nothing other than a pattern and construct of God's wisdom, a human being will naturally be moved to joy when this construct and wisdom of the benevolent creator is instilled into his ears and subsequently into his heart and affections through such reverberating numbers. And should a well-disposed individual hear music, his spirit senses the beauty which the Creator has ordered, but he would remain unaware of its source had not the divinely ordered numerals and harmonic proportions shown him the way. This too was repeated throughout the 18th century. 1725, Fuchs wrote, The octave is contained in many things, and its inherent proportions 1 to 2 make it the most perfect interval of all. It can easily be seen that this ordering was wonderfully adhered to by God in all his works and creatures. Now, in 1742, Mitzler translated and amplified Fuchs and put a footnote at this point, writing, "These edifying thoughts are founded on the old truth. The more complex a thing is, the more imperfect it is. The more simple a thing is, the more perfect it is. That is why philosophers have always had to consider God to be the simplest of all beings above all others, and hence, logically, also the most absolutely perfect." Now, these views are commonplace, but now we have to jump between theory and practice. Understanding the theory and theology, musicians claimed that the perfect proportions move the emotions and recommended proportional ordering. In 1717, Raupach gave his views on the various powerful effects of music on the hearts and minds of people, writing, "The 2 consonances, the octave and the fifth, cause a certain expansion of the life spirits," which is what Bettina talks about, "the former to a greater extent than the second, as a result of the size of their proportions, which have the form 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. And as we've also seen, 1 to 1 was considered even more perfect." Matteson, the music theorist who always has many answers and guidelines to offer, in this case, frustratingly, still doesn't say exactly how. "What is required is an elegant ordering of the parts in the melody or in an entire work, almost in the way one orders and designs a building and makes a plan or sketch to show where specific rooms should be placed. Loveliness consists in precise observation of the correct proportion of all parts of a melody or work with one another. And the composer should outline his complete project on a sheet of paper, sketch it roughly, and then set it in order before proceeding. In my opinion, this is the absolute best way to organize the work so that each part demonstrates a true proportion, uniformity, and unison, for nothing in the world is more pleasing to the ear than this. Moreover, ich Gleichförmigkeit, equality, which is 1 to 1, in all things, if it contributes a great deal, so that it is not only pleasant to the human senses, but also thereby becomes more long-lasting, as is well known to good architects. Then it is easy to guess why some things lose little or nothing of their inner goodness with age. But how? Question mark. How did composers put these long-lasting, well-structured and perfect 1 to 1 unisons and 1 to 2 proportions that emanate from and even describe the wisdom of God, and that would move the listener so powerfully? Were 1 to 1 and 1 to 2 proportions deliberately incorporated into musical structures in various ways to make them more emotionally affective? Musicologists have traditionally jumped to the Affektenlehre from such descriptions. And although the intervallic proportions are necessarily part of it, this is clearly not the entire spectrum of effects that emanate from all consonances, as well as the motions of meter and beat, as we've heard say. So my first 2 examples are of short-term effects in Handel's Alleluia Chorus, thanks to Fred Verleisen's paper, who's speaking now in a parallel stream. After the fully harmonized opening, Handel suddenly breaks into a striking unison and octave passage, unison being 1 to 1, octave being 1 to 2, using stepwise pitches in a symmetrical palindromic 1 to 1 shape, A to B to C sharp to D to C sharp to B, a symmetrical pitch pattern. And there's an octave jump at the word God omni, which is 1 to 2. These are all expressions of 1 to 1 and 1 to 2. I can't remember if I shared my sound. If I didn't, please tell me, because this will sound dreadful, but here's a very short excerpt to remind you.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
as you heard, that's, very striking. It comes in octaves and as unison and in octaves. A few bars later, God is again described in unison. This time it's the sopranos singing King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the same note, the unison, and they are in unison. There's another example of unison in Messiah used for God, and it's the unison in the male voices in the opening of "The Lord gave the word," which is the most profound theological point in Christianity. So did Handel choose this because of how he understood God, proportions, and emotional effects in proportions? Then there's the obvious symmetry you get in the arrangements of sections of parts. Here you see chorus, yeah, typical, we all know about that. And then come to larger scale examples related to the pulsing of tactus, Leibniz-like, where the effect is felt even though we don't know we are counting. This is an example of consecutive one-to-one from the Sonata of the Musical Offering, an offering for the king fittingly in one-to-one. And here's an example, I'm nearly finished, from Youngest Son, JCF, where you get 2-to-1 in 1776. They are consecutive, and this would be picked up in the pulses. So the listener subconsciously pulses the bars regardless of changing tempi in these consecutive and symmetrical structures, and thereby they sense the architectural symmetry of the classical one-to-one and one-to-two structure. The body is moved by the vibrations, the life spirit's expanded, and finally the emotions are moved without ever knowing how or why. So that's a taster of the 18th century theory and some examples of possible practice. That's it.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth, for your presentation. And there's so much to take away there and for us to think about in preparation for the discussion. We'll now move to our third presenter, Professor John Butt.
The presentation I gave in the previous film has actually now been published in its full version earlier this year. The title of the article, if you're interested, is Bach and the Dance of Humankind, which is a skit on the old Wilfrid Mellor's book, Bach and the Dance of God. And it comes within Cambridge University Press volume called Musicology and Dance, edited by Davinia Caddy and Maribeth Clark, if you're interested in looking at it in more detail. And what I suggest is that music is both inflected by dance, in Bach's case, and other composers too, but also what is slightly more subtle, it's also about dance and consequently about your previous experience of embodied thought and emotion. So that's a very, very brief summary of that article. And what I'm going to try and do in the last section of this is to account for two pieces that I've performed and in fact recorded recently, and which have particularly influenced me in thinking further about this subject. The first one is not actually by Bach at all. It's Jean-Philippe Rameau's Pygmalion of 1748, which is a one-act opera about the Ovid story of Pygmalion. And as you probably know, the perfected statue is brought to life by a prayer to Venus, and the beautiful statue starts to move. That's the first thing she does. And then she asks existential questions. Who am I? What am I doing here? What's happening here? And of course, she's doing this in music, which perhaps Rameau and his contemporaries saw as a primal form of human expression. What she basically demonstrates then is the notion of the blank slate who learns through experience. And this is very well documented in French culture of the time as an import from British empiricism. But most interesting for my topic here is that she is then taught to dance, and movement becomes absolutely fundamental to her being. And in fact, the original actor and the implications of this score are that the statue does more as a dancer than as a speaker. She dominates the scene through her increasingly skillful dancing. And what Rameau does here is provide an astonishing catalogue of French dances, one which transforms into the next, and often only heard in fragmentary form. It's like a sort of sales catalogue, really, for the best dancers of the period. It starts with a rather stumbling saraband, as if she's trying to dance and hasn't quite done it, and being shown by the Graces how to do it. And eventually it ends with a refined and developed saraband, which is danced by the statue alone. Now, as I've said already, there is the obvious British influence here, but also the figure that really comes to my mind is Abbé de Condillac, the French thinker on embodiment. He's mentioned at the end of my original essay. And he's a figure who saw gesture and dance as fundamental to the human condition, followed by music, and only then followed by speech. His later treatise from the 1750s was perhaps inspired by Rameau, I think, where the statue learns the world. In other words, Condillac suggests a statue as a sort of primal human being who learns about the world and all the human affordances through touch. And this forms the very basis of being. Now, obviously, this has very little to do directly with Bach, but it clearly shows that he was very much part of a broader cultural world, which consciously emulated French culture, and also brings in this notion of touch, feeling, dance as essential human characteristics. My analysis of dance-inspired movements, interestingly, in Italianate styles of music, da capo, concerto, and so on, these can be multiplied ad infinitum, showing dialogues between national and historical styles, and I would claim co-opting our memory of what we know already. Hence the way I think this sort of music, Bach's music in particular, still works today, albeit now with a different bank of memories that we bring to this music. One final performance experience for me made me ask the question, how did Bach show the potential for reflective and actualized emotion before he was fully influenced by the modern Italian style and before he'd fully digested dance or even perhaps encountered it? Are his insights into the way we might listen and feel in real time possibly evident really early on? Here, the actus tragicus is the obvious thing to look at, Gottes Zeit. Well-known symmetrical structure, but also with a sense of linear development and psychological change. The coming of the New Testament allusions introduces the astonishing part of the soprano calling for Jesus, and the remainder of the cantata brings the mitigating comfort of the New Covenant, which retunes old Hebrew law. In the first half of the cantata, the emotions are very much representations, typical 17th century style. In him we live, in him we die, different mournful music. Put your house in order. The old covenant says you must die. The music here, using my film hat, you could say is Mickey Mousing. It's a sort of picture book of images, much like some of the school devotional literature of the time. But the Christian portion is strikingly different in its implication for emotion, because here we have unexpected, distorted and immediate moments right from the soprano entry, which is surely the best known aspect of this cantata. And the extended piece in Deine Hände, although very much in the same ostinato style of the early music, develops into something much more extraordinary. The bass taken up to the very highest part of the range, and we really hear and feel a sort of otherworldly sound with Jesus's words, "Today I will be with you in paradise." But I think there's also the case of sudden gaps in the texture on the words, for instance, sanft und stille, and also der Tod ist mein Schlafworden. There's sudden moments of a clearing, as it were, in the sound, which forces us, as it were, to sort of reflect on this by really giving a jarring or comforting but jarring sensation to our ongoing listening experience. Now, obviously, all I've mentioned can come under the general heading of word painting, and analogues can be found with many earlier composers. But in this context, I think what counts is the setting up of regularity and then the arrest or modification of movement. Bach, in other words, is already showing the potential for music that not only models our experience in the present, but gives us time to reflect and absorb the emotional, physical and mental implications of concepts. In all, then, this might remind us of the reflections of Erdmann Neumeister and others, that if a style of music has a strong emotional effect in the secular world, as operatic aria, why can't it be adopted to spiritual practice? The emotional level, then, is co-opted for the spiritual, but I would also argue Bach is also reflecting on the developments in the broader human world. Stirring, training, and co-option of emotions are all ways of deepening our own sense of being and our personal and communal development. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John, for another fantastic presentation. So we have had three very diverse approaches to Bach and the emotions: the physiological from Bettina, the proportional or mathematical from Ruth, and then John's approach through the physical and regulative qualities of dance, with a number of different contexts brought in, such as the English and French context as well. And I'm really delighted to see the interface with performance coming through in all of these presentations. So I'd like to invite Wendy Heller now to propose a question.
First of all, I adored the video that the three of you did. I just found it really uplifting to think through these issues the way the three of you have. And I sort of had two sort of comments, questions, and you could go off in any direction you want, but just to sort of stimulate some discussion. One is, I was struck in the video how the commonalities in all three of your approaches, that there was, if you made that Venn diagram, there was definitely a place, Ruth, where your work and you're thinking about how proportions feel, and Bettina, the wonderful bodily work, and John's dance really provide us with a new way of thinking about Bach, in a way as if, oh, we're actually allowed to think about emotion, which right away already lifts up, I think, a screen on something that's maybe been an issue in the past. So I would invite you, if you wanted to say a little more for this audience about where you think those commonalities are. So that would be the first part. The second part that could be part of that would be where you'd like to see this work go, as other people like me listen to it and go, this is so great, you know, sort of. So that would be a second question. You can take any of this that you please. And then the third part, I'm thinking mostly John, I can't wait to spend more time with you and think about this more next year, I hope, but is when you have these dances, what's so interesting in some ways about Bach is we're not getting dances, of course, in the order that one gets in a prescribed suite. We're getting them in this moment, and then it disappears in that moment. And we're getting them over the progression of a cantata. I mean, there's a difference between a minuet at the beginning of a cantata than one that happens at the end, you know, and so on. So I think that there are some interesting questions that might be raised about that.
First of all, to bring discourse on Bach and surrounding repertoire sort of up to speed with that, almost. But then also to see where that can take us more broadly in terms of how we think about, say, an early modern Western anthropology, and how music gives us a sort of way into those much broader questions about what were, how did human beings, how were they constituted, and how did they interact with the world, and sort of using music as a way to alienate us a little bit from the ways in which being an early modern self, an early modern musician, really takes a sort of leap of the imagination for us to try and re-enter into that. And I think music just has this potential to allow us to make that leap. And then I think that ideally will reflect back onto the way we perform this stuff, and the way we analyze it, and the way we talk about it, and all those things. But for me, it's this way in which music can serve as this portal to seeing something in quite a different way that I find most exciting about.
Very, very briefly, the commonalities and the overlapping was very exciting, because when we made the video, of course, we didn't know what each other was going to say, except I did have an idea of Bettina's topic, because I'd heard her speak about something. And when I made my little discovery about, you know, proportions possibly being literally to do with moving emotions, which happened literally one day when I was relaxing and sitting reading a new translation of Werkmeister. I got in touch with Bettina straight away and said, am I treading on your toes? And she said, no, continue, go with it, run with it. And as I was preparing for this, and because I knew Fred Verleisen's examples, because I'd seen his presentation 2 weeks ago, and I realized, oh my goodness me, what am I looking at? I'm looking at a demonstration. And yesterday, Fred said something else to me in a chat. And when I was having supper late last night, we got out the score of Messiah and we found, you know, God spoke the word or whatever. We saw that and I thought, exactly. And then this afternoon, Fred's just told me about BWV 196, you know, this unison passage. So what I'm excited about is actually collaborating, crossing ideas that none of us as individuals would know the whole truth. So that's the first thing. I think the overlapping is fantastic because it saves us a lot of time, and I'm going to be quoting Bettina. And where will it go? Well, I have the disadvantage here because I work in a topic which gets everybody very hot under the collar, which is numbers. And traditionally, people get very, very cross with me, but it's quite ridiculous because it's all there. And, you know, I would like to see a freedom with this because, you know, when the science is there, when all the history is pieced together, you know, I would come straight in and say to John, let's talk about Rameau and Rousseau, about the perfect sculpture that was created, about the arguments between Rousseau and Rameau about exactly that, classicism and Pythagorean numbers getting out. Why did they choose that particular story? What was happening, and why then was dance the first thing that when she was the perfect body started to move? Why was it something in which you have to count part of it? It's a body, it's a counting, but it's fundamental to existence. And you know, what's his name? I can't remember. Pygmalion was, you know, he was the God figure, as it were. He created the perfect thing. So you've got all these resonances coming in that we don't have to be musicians to know. We have to be old-fashioned people who know classical stories and who dare to speak about these things, but bring them in with specialist knowledge. So there is a lot of overlapping and there's a long way to go.
One crossover, I think, with what Ruth was saying, of course, is this notion of proportions, and the dance steps and the whole notion of the length of dances is very much wound into that too. But also the notion of unconscious calculating is one that's particularly topical in the 1720s, because that's a period when the harmonic series is first really discovered, the overtone series, and how that notion is that one is hearing some form of harmony even when one is hearing a single note. One is unconscious, in other words, of that sort of harmony. That's particularly apt, I think, for this period. But I think if there's any one direction I personally am always thinking and going, it's this notion of accumulated experience, both in terms of one's lifetime, but also in terms of one's listening experience, because this is something that links us to the people of Bach's age, even if our experiences are entirely different. The way in which they might impinge on one another could be quite similar. We never know for sure, but I think that's one of the things that both makes this music historically interesting in its own time, but also opens up the potential for understanding and using it in our current situation, because composers of this time, and I suggest Bach in particular, have a particular view of how we inhere in time and how we mould our consciousness. And it's interesting, I think that Handel does the same thing as well, but in a very different way, a more syntagmatic way, I would say. And Rameau, likewise. I think those three figures, you know, do it in three very different ways. But that's something that really, really thrills me in a way, because it does give the potential for a leap from the dead past to the live present.
I'm very sad to say it's almost time for this session to come to a close. I'd like to add one more thing about proportions, just in response to something that Ruth said, which is that in my view, coming from a performance studies perspective as well, you couldn't be an instrumentalist or a composer or even a singer in the early modern period without always being aware of proportions, you know, the Pythagorean proportions and the the consonances added by Zarlino in the scenario, because, you know, on your instruments, the strings would have, the diameters of the strings would have the proportions of 3:2 or for a fifth, or whatever else they are. And so these proportions were very much at the top of everyone's head. When I put a new string on my violin, I'm always measuring it to make sure that it's fitting the proportion of 3:2. But that's a whole other area of lived experience. And I think that what's come out of this session very much today is corporeality and the emotions and the corporeality of music in this period. And I'd like to thank all the three speakers again, and also the entire assembly here, everyone participating, and the Bach Network.